Recognizing the member from North Saanich and the Islands.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to Bill 10, the Budget Measures Implementation Act. I know that I've got some watchers on the other side. They're going to be holding me very accountable. Today I want to talk about the significant changes that are proposed within the Bill 10, changes to the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, the GRCA. Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act. These changes, in addition to the new Energy Action Framework that was announced last week and the approval of new LNG projects, natural gas projects, will significantly impact energy and climate policy in British Columbia. And I think what I'll be trying to understand is how these pieces, and specifically the piece that's being outlined here in Bill 10, interacts, and how it interacts with the other pieces that are moving. However, the implications of these changes mostly won't be understood or determined for a number of months, as much of the detail is going to be coming through regulation of this bill and further consultation for those other pieces. The province has the legislative authority under the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act to regulate emissions from industry. March 2021, BC set sectoral targets covering emissions across the economy. The oil and gas industry is currently responsible for around 50% of the industrial emissions and 20% of BC's total emissions. The sectoral target for the oil and gas industry aims to reduce emissions 33% to 38% by 2030. Amendments to the GRCA that are made here in Bill 10 exempt large emitters from paying carbon tax up front and introduces a new Made in BC output-based pricing system, or OBPS, output-based pricing system, to match the federal government's carbon pricing schedule beginning in 2024. The success of BC's output-based pricing system will ultimately rely on its ability to incentivize emissions reductions through stringent emissions thresholds, regular updates to the output-based pricing system rates, and the validation processes that hold emitters to account. Given the current lack of details around BC's output-based pricing system, look forward to hearing the answers from the Minister at committee stage about this government's decision to pursue a Made in BC system rather than utilizing the federal model, and how these changes relate to BC's LNG strategy and our reliance on carbon offsets to meet our climate targets. In addition to the changes to the GRCA under Bill 10, and in relationship to the changes that are made to that act under Bill 10, this government just announced a more significant change to energy policy with the new Energy Action Framework. Under the new framework, the province requires all proposed LNG facilities in or entering the environmental assessment process to pass an emissions test with a credible plan to be net zero by 2030. However, this does not apply to the already permitted projects, Cedar LNG, LNG Canada's Phase 1 and 2, wood fiber LNG, or wood fiber LNG. And net zero does not encompass upstream emissions, the emissions created when exported fossil fuels are burned overseas. Similar to the changes made in this bill, Bill 10, to the GRCA, the new framework also lacks the details, and I have many questions, Madam Speaker. How will net zero be defined? Is this government relying solely on carbon credits to be net zero? How will the new emissions cap and other regulations, like stricter methane rules, affect industry investment in the sector? How do the changes in Bill 10 speak and interact with the new framework that's also largely undefined? I'm worried that the sector ultimately won't be held accountable. We've got an output-based pricing system that's being outlined in here, but what message is this going to send to the fossil fuel industry? If we let the industry get away with a credible plan to be net zero, I think we're going to lose, Madam Speaker. A credible plan to be net zero could just be purchasing the cheapest offsets that are out there. Other methods of decreasing emissions produced by the gas sector could include carbon capture and storage. But the recent International Panel on Climate Change report noted that this would be the most costly and least effective way to tackle the problem that we face and that is partly being addressed here through the bill that we're debating today. The Energy Action Framework also establishes a Clean Energy and Major Projects Office to fast-track investment in clean energy and technology. It seems, at first blush, like an office to greenlight more greenhouse gas emissions in the province. This new office will not necessarily increase solar, wind, geothermal, or tidal energy, all of which the IPCC report says that we need to be investing in robustly. The new framework that was announced after Bill 10 was put on the table also includes a regulatory cap for oil and gas industry to ensure British Columbia meets its 2030 emissions reduction target for the sector. The details of this are unclear as the province still needs to engage with stakeholders on the design of the regulatory cap on oil and gas sector emissions, including on issues like how the cap will be allocated, credit trading, and verifiable offsets. I'm worried that this consultation process will become yet another source of delay. I wonder, Madam Speaker, how the province's emissions cap for oil and gas industry will be operationalized. What will the starting point for the cap and how will it be allocated? How will the cap be harmonized with the intentions of the federal emissions cap in the same space? And most importantly, how does this government intend on enforcing it? How will the changes that we're debating through Bill 10 and the province's move from their current carbon tax system to a new output-based pricing system for large emitters factor into the carbon accounting related into the new emissions cap announced outside of this process? It's clear that in Bill 10 that the changes to the output-based pricing system, as with the Energy Action Framework, that the devil is very much hidden in the details. What's clear, however, is that this government is trying to reconcile fossil fuel expansion with climate action. The new output-based pricing system proposed in Bill 10 will be used to meet emissions targets. However, the government missed the previous goal of 33% reduction by 2020, with emissions instead remaining more or less unchanged from that target of the 2007 levels. The most surefire way to limit emissions, Madam Speaker, I think is the obvious one that everyone in this room knows, and that's to stop expanding the fossil fuel infrastructure. However, this government did the exact opposite in approving Cedar LNG and giving Kasai Lisms the green light for an environmental assessment. Cedar LNG, a floating facility to be constructed near Kitimat, will export 3 million tons of LNG and produce 1.2 megatons of emissions annually for 40 years. Upstream, the project would add an additional 39 megatons, about the same amount of emissions producing by putting 8.4 million cars on the road for a year or driving around the planet 12 million times. The government used the Energy Action Framework as a smokescreen for greenlighting more fossil fuels. Even before the approval of Cedar LNG, critics were warning BC is unlikely to meet its 2025 or 2030 goals. How does this government reconcile the need to reduce emissions while approving new emissions-intensive fossil fuel projects? In order to reduce global warming, we need to act urgently within this decade. The recent IPCC report makes it clear. Avoiding the worst-case scenario is only possible if we stop expanding oil and gas and coal projects. It doesn't matter how many of these output-based pricing systems or how many times we decide to try to shift the focus somewhere else. The reality is, if we're increasing emissions and we are allowing the largest emitters to not have to pay up front, the reality is that those emitters are going to continue to emit. Missing in this discussion is the need to limit fossil fuel production as we move to net zero emissions by 2050. We urgently need to figure out a managed decline of the industry and a fair transition for workers and communities. Or else, we might find ourselves in this situation that my colleague from Mackenzie, Prince George Mackenzie, noted with the hundreds and thousands of jobs that have been lost in his riding. We are addicted to fossil fuels and the revenue they generate, Madam Speaker. The recent surge in global oil and gas prices has resulted in record profits for oil and gas companies. Shell just posted record profits of $40 billion US, doubling last year's record profits. Shell owns the largest share in LNG Canada. We're talking about an output-based pricing system in Bill 10 that companies such as Shell are implicated in. How is it that I'm not able to speak to the system that they're going to be implicating them? This province is too dependent on those revenues from the oil and gas industry. And in February 2023, the province released an updated labor market outlook with major projected growth in the oil and gas sector. I can sympathize with how difficult it is to change a system. We're partly trying to make adjustments through this output-based pricing system. But this government has the opportunity to do just that. They have a majority and the support from the public. A recent poll found that a majority of British Columbians would rather see the provincial government directing its investments and support to clean energy projects than new fossil fuel projects. We have an opportunity to be global leaders. Instead, we're following. Despite this government's rhetoric on the need to reduce emissions and act on climate, they've been ineffective in curbing emissions, meeting our legislated targets. Approving more LNG projects adds fuel to that fire, Madam Speaker. Bill 10, the changes in this bill to the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act exempt large industries from paying the regular carbon tax up until a certain limit. But what that limit is set at via regulation by this government, without the input of the Legislative Assembly and without the ability for debate. What I outlined in this speech is the reality that there is a large number of complex measures that are being put in place all at the same time, mostly with very little content involved in them. They are frameworks. The details of them have not been thought through. The impact, how the energy action framework that I noted, the approvals of LNG, impact with this output-based pricing system, and the fundamental question of why it is that we are allowing multinational billion-dollar profiting corporations to be able to shift their responsibility away from paying what British Columbians, at the very least, if this is just about money, then they should be paying what British Columbians expect them to be paying, their share. And so, as we go through this, we will be asking the questions, the tough questions of this government, how it is that they are going to achieve what they say that they're going to achieve, and that is meeting our climate action commitments while approving more fossil fuels, expecting there to be more jobs being created in an industry that should be sunsetting, and expecting those revenues to pay the way at a time in which we're facing a climate emergency. And with that, I'll take my seat. Hi, Scotia.